I'd just like to welcome everybody, those of you who are joining us to hear our speakers, and indeed our speakers for being with us for our PCP. And I would like to start by asking our speakers to just introduce themselves, and then we'll talk about what the PCP is about and what the format will be. Welcome, colleagues who are joining us as I'm speaking. So to begin with, I am Caroline Gattrell. I'm one of the 3 general editors at the Journal of Management Studies. I'm really delighted that we're all here for this Point-Counterpoint. It's lovely to bring the words to life and be able to talk about these things that are very important, and to ask of our speakers to share their views beyond what's written in the paper. So I am one of the 3 general editors at JMS, and I'm Professor of Organisation Studies at the University of Liverpool. And so to begin with, if I may, I will ask our speakers to very kindly introduce themselves. Maybe we'll start with the point, and I will ask Christine and Ghazi to just say a few words about who you are and where you are today, maybe, and where you're working.
Yes, I'll start. Hi, my name is Christine Moser. I'm a professor of sustainable organizing at the VU Amsterdam, the Netherlands. It's very fantastic to see so many friends and co-authors and new faces or new names. Yeah, looking forward to having this conversation, because the written word is one way to express thoughts, but a very generative way is to actually talk about these ideas and see how we can move them forward.
Oh, thank you, Christine. Ghazi, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ghazi Islam. I'm a professor of People, Organizations, and Society at the Grenoble École de Management in Grenoble, France. I'm a member of the research group Reimagining Work. I do research on micro and meso level organization studies and some critical management perspectives. So I'm very glad to be here and to have this discussion about emerging technologies, big data, and algorithms. So looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, thanks so much, Ghazi. There is a 3rd member of the Point team, Dirk Lindebaum, who is with us in spirit today but isn't able to join us in person. May I please ask colleagues from our counterpoints to just briefly introduce themselves? Vern and Jennifer, could you possibly just say hi?
Sure. I'm Vern Glazer. I'm a professor of entrepreneurship and family enterprise at the University of Alberta, and I've been studying AI and related phenomenon for a while, and I'm very interested in how organizations actually deploy these technologies in the real world.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Sloan. I am just finishing my PhD here, finally, and I'm thankful for this opportunity. My research looks at future construction in organizations, and so obviously algorithms, analytics, AI, all of those different pieces of that puzzle come into play pretty prominently in the work that I do.
Thank you, Jennifer. There is a 3rd author also with our counterpoint team who's not able to be with us today, and that is Joel. I don't know how you pronounce it. Is it Gaiman?
It's Gaiman.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those introductions. So just to give a sense of what we're talking about today and why it's so important, I felt this was a really key contemporary PCP. The point sounds a warning bell about the rise of corporate analytics in academic research. On the one hand, it could be argued that scholars ought to beware the glitter of data gold mines. All that glitters is not gold, and corporate big data might be vast, but it's not neutral. Platforms like Google and Meta collect what's useful for them, not necessarily what might be meaningful for us. They're influenced by commercial interests themselves, and these data are lacking in transparency, and inevitably they're oriented towards the interests of the sponsoring organization. On the other hand, the counterpoint could be very compelling, because it could be argued that corporate big data is the management researcher's new crystal ball. We see things we wouldn't otherwise have seen or wouldn't be able to afford without it. It's bigger, it's faster, algorithmically big word, enhanced. So do we want to understand how teams collaborate? Well, we don't need to ask them. We can perhaps analyze their Slack metadata. Curious about consumer loyalty? Well, follow the digital trail through shopping baskets and browser tabs. Amazon. We can now observe organizational and consumer lives in real time and at scale. Why settle for 30 survey responses when you can analyze 3 million clicks? It kind of brings me on to AI, which is something that I'm particularly interested in. I don't know quite how I feel about AI. In one way, it's terrific. In another way, it's terrifying, to quote a recent article in the Sunday Times. Looking at what authors say about AI, I was really interested to note that the author Louis de Bernier, who wrote Captain Corelli's Mandolin, is really angry about his work being scraped up and dumped in AI and being drawn upon. He feels it's unethical. He feels it compromises his position as an author, and he feels it shouldn't be used as something that's free. On the other hand, Harlan Coben, who is also a very well-known author, said, I don't care. They can do what they like with it. It's out there. I'm somebody who's got a lot of confidence in my writing ability. I don't think AI could pretend to be me. There's nobody else except me who can do this the way that I do it. So I don't know. The jury is out. So for me, this is a really, really timely and important PCP. And I'd like to start by asking colleagues to talk about the point to begin with. So please would Christine and Ghazi share with us their views.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. We will. I will share my slides. We have prepared a few slides for you. And well, maybe to start with, the jury is still out for us as well. What we have tried to express here in the point essay is a way to think about, think a little bit more on the macro level about what using big data and algorithms and so on means for us as researchers. I don't think we judge per se, but we try to point out particular ramifications of using such data, which shape how we can do research once big data and algorithms are involved. And others might judge whether or not that's a good thing or, well, actually Ghazi and I are working on a kind of sequel. Hopefully that will be finished soon, Ghazi, so let me start presenting. And again, this is joint work with Dirk Lindebaum as well from University of Bath, who couldn't be here, unfortunately, today. So what our starting point was this observation that so much research nowadays celebrates big data. And this quote here says that this is a world where massive amounts of data and applied mathematics replace every tool of research. Out with every theory of human behavior, forget taxonomy, ontology, and psychology. Who knows why people do what they do? The point is they do it, and with enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. And this, you know, if you tease it out like this, it sounds drastic, but actually it's not, because you might have seen some of the editorials arguing for phenomenon-driven research, you know, forget about the theorizing, put all the data forward. And some disciplines, scientific disciplines, including computer science, argue for we don't need theory at all. We have the data and we can crunch them, and that's all we need. And we thought, well, is it the case? Let's see what happens. So Caroline already alluded to something that we have coined in this piece, corporate empiricism. So here we observe that big data and algorithms are being produced and owned by multinationals. Although most recent developments in the US have maybe kind of triggered new dynamics here. Right now, big tech is commercial. And for scientific purposes, that's not the worst, but it's driven by logics behind commercial. And I want to point out that right now, this is not a critique of commercial companies, not at all. However, we want to point out that these commercial companies have goals and objectives which are very different from what the goals and objectives we as scientists have. And that is just a different basic assumption and point of departure. The aim of these organizations is to generate profit. Again, that's fine. That's just what organizations do, or many organizations. However, it doesn't really match scientific aims, because usually we should at least also generate scientific insights next to scientific profit, which some of us also have to do. And finally, big tech commercial firms are not interested in the checks and balances and intervening. And this point of observation has actually gotten worse now with a new administration in the US, where most big tech, or actually all of the big ones, are based. So we now see that if there were checks and balances, they are actually being removed now, and interventions are seen as something unnecessary, which is, again, something that in science we don't want. Quite the contrast. In science, we want checks and balances. We want to make sure that whatever we do and produce in research is actually true and carried out according to scientific norms. So 2 reasons to look at this. We have a shift from scientific explanation to predictions of economically exploitable correlations. And also what we see happening is that this shapes data generation and analysis, which then in turn shapes social reality. Ghazi will in a second talk about an example that we describe in the paper. But before he does that, I want to share with you this model that we present in the paper. So what you see here is on the right-hand side, our DV, so to say, is potential risks for management theory, where we describe how big data and algorithms can impact scientific validity of our findings, and also how they can shape the theory that we create from the findings. And we explain that alongside 3 interconnected things, concepts, constructs, if you may. One is scaling. This is about the use of conveniently available measures that can be scaled. So something that is available is usually used in big data crunching, simply because if it's convenient and available, it will be used whatever the data actually is. And scaling also refers to the scaling it literally in terms of quantities. So big is better in this kind of thinking, and available, again, is better. This also connects to the use of proxies. So these are measures that substitute for something that is not directly available. In other fields of science, we also do that. Like in psychology, you cannot really measure some psychological construct. However, there are pretty strict rules for making sure, or at least trying to make sure, that what you then measure is a good proxy for that construct. In big data and algorithm management, this is not very often not the case. So you would, for example, simply use your postal code as a proxy for income. And while there might be a correlation, there's surely no causation. So that's what we want to allude to here. And finally, algorithmic decision-making, which is automated decision-making, which is, we say here often, but I would actually argue now it's always biased. And it cannot be other than based on predefined rules and or goals. And even if it's self-learning algorithms, there will be a bias in it, simply because humans are biased. And any algorithmic decision-making will be that too. Doesn't have to be necessarily negative, but it's simply, it's baked into this function. And because it's algorithms, it can be scaled very easily. And that's what makes it different from other biased decision-making. Together, these 3 things form the perform big data and algorithms, and then can pose risks for management theory. And now, Ghazi, do you want to talk shortly about the example we have in the paper?
Yes, thank you, Christine. And can you hear me clearly, just to make sure? Yeah. So okay, so I'll talk quickly about this example, but then I want to also sort of give a bit of a bigger picture as to what this example is supposed to illustrate in terms of our larger philosophical underpinning and the nature of our critique. So we give the example of Google Trends and some work that researchers have been doing around looking at the reliability of Google Trends over time and finding that if some very basic facts about things like names of cities are put in Google Trends, they tend to show some variation over time that would be inexplicable by changes in the underlying structure of reality. You know, things that don't change often end up coming out differently in Google Trends. This was attributed to underlying changes in the algorithms, which were often not reported, which are untransparent, so that very basic facts about the world can vary based on opaque differences in algorithms that are done for reasons that are not made public. So that was the example that we gave, but there are many others that could be cited where control over what data looks like is made by companies in ways that are not following scientific protocols or not open in ways that a scientific community can audit or verify. And this really sort of encapsulates two different aspects of what our critique is. And I think it's important to clarify for the discussion. On the one hand, we have a dimension you might call the epistemic dimension of what we're talking about between data and theorization. So scientists have over the history of empirical sciences debated the relative roles of theory and data, including citing Sotheby here, his 2014 essay on critiquing Dust Bowl empiricism and the way that some highly empirically oriented researchers have tried to say, let's just get rid of theory and just use data. And if you have enough data, you don't need to have theory. And there is a sort of controversy about what is the relation between theory and data and the possible critiques of Dust Bowl empiricism. So we see that as a sort of epistemological issue that happens within the scientific realm as well. So it's not just a question of data versus theory. But when you combine that with the second axis, which is about the motives or the political or the you could say the knowledge-based motives, where you have on the one hand truth-seeking motives and the other hand profit-seeking motives, which maps somewhat on the distinction between science or academia and corporations. And we say that somewhat because we don't want to make the argument that all university research is purely truth-seeking, and we also don't want to make the argument that all corporations are inherently only profit-driven. Corporations can also be truth-seeking, and academics, as we all know, can also be profit-driven. But we're saying that at least there's a normative orientation between academic and scientific research, between truth-seeking motives, and in corporations between profit-seeking motives. So the problem we really see is when you cross these two dimensions, the epistemological focus on data versus theory and the motive difference between truth-seeking and profit-driven motives, one of the quadrants you end up with is this quadrant of data-driven profit-seeking. And that's what we call corporate empiricism. So what we're doing is not a critique of empiricism per se, nor is it simply a critique of corporate speculation. It's actually where the data-driven focus on knowledge production crosses the profit orientation, and that's where we see a particular danger, where you have processes of generating data that rely on institutional credit and credibility that cannot be guaranteed by the corporate basis. And we can go a little bit more into that in the discussion, why we think that's a particularly dangerous quadrant. But essentially what we're saying is that that's form of knowledge generation crosses the most dangerous form of knowledge driving motives with the most opaque form of epistemological drivenness. So you have data which is supposed to be credible that is being produced by actors which do not have institutional legitimacy, and that's where we think the real danger happens. So I'll draw it to a close there, but I'd like to thank you all for this discussion and looking forward to a nice debate.
Thank you so much, both of you, for a really interesting point. I'm sure people have got some burning questions. However, if we may, I'd like to go on to the counterpoint now, and then we can have a really good debate and discussion when we've heard both sides of the story. So may I ask Vern and Jen to step in, please? I think James is very kindly going to share these slides. If we can take the point, yeah, one's off. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. And I mean, what important arguments and issues that Ghazi and Christine have raised. Thank you for that. Today, I'm going to be presenting our argument based on the based on the paper, and I would say that we're offering a more optimistic perspective than what was just presented. As Christine alluded to, this point counterpoint is really looking at what these changes, I guess, in our data landscapes are doing to us as management theorists and how that's impacting the work that we do. And so in our side of things, we're going to explain a new metaphor and explain how we think that it helps us understand the complexity of contemporary organizations and opens up some new theoretical possibilities. Can I have the next slide, please, James? And perhaps maybe can you pop it into presentation mode? I don't know that everyone wants to see the sidebar. As he's working on that, I'm just going to open with a quote, and this is the same quote that we open our paper with. New metaphors are capable of creating new understandings and therefore new realities. For us, we don't see metaphors as only linguistic devices. We think that they fundamentally shape how we think about and understand the world. So we suggest a new metaphor in this paper to help us understand organizations in the algorithmic age. Next slide, please, James. Here's just a succinct statement. By envisioning organizations as algorithms, scholars can leave the grim outlook presented by the Point essay while provoking opportunities for innovative and relevant theorizing in an age increasingly characterized by algorithmic decision-making. We'll pop into the next slide, please. We introduce some existing metaphors. As we all know, these are drawn from Gareth Morgan's work, Images in Organization, but metaphors have a long history in management theory. We're going to talk about 3 of them. Organizations as machines, that's our first. Organizations as organisms, and organizations as brains. Can you go to the next slide, please, James? So organizations as machines, we'll recognize this from Max Weber's work, from Taylor's work. It's an incredibly useful way of thinking about organizations in stable environments, routine tasks. However, this type of metaphor tends to dehumanize workers, and it often fails in dynamic environments. As Lindebaum and colleagues have noted, applying this metaphor to algorithms risks mechanizing values, further limiting its utility in the algorithmic age. Next slide, please. The next slide looks at organizations as brains. Thank you. So theoretical roots here, Carnegie School, cybernetics, looking at organizations as learning organisms, as organisms capable of making decisions. One of the challenges with this metaphor for today is that it suffers from ambiguity about brain functionality, and it often overlooks power dynamics that are really, I mean, as we've just heard, incredibly crucial in algorithmic contexts. Let's move to the next one, please. Organizations as organisms. This organism metaphor, it really focuses on adaptation to the environment, drawing from a lot of open systems theory work and population ecology. So the strength here is that it really does recognize environmental contexts, but it at the same time obscures how organizations are products of human creativity and assumes kind of this functional unity within these spaces. Critically, it also underplays organizations' abilities to create new ecologies, and that becomes very difficult to get our heads around in an algorithmic age. Moving to the next slide, please, James. Thank you. So the fundamental limitation here is that they conceptualize organizations as distinct from their environment. They do acknowledge some connections at times, but algorithmic organizing, we argue, fundamentally challenges this separation. Organizations and environments have become algorithmically co-constituted. So this co-constitution is central to the metaphor that we're presenting here, and we believe that it opens up some new theoretical possibilities. Next slide, please. So as we were thinking about how to draw this metaphor together, we were looking to assemblage theory. So our metaphor builds on this idea, seeing algorithms as entangled in assemblages that comprise data, algorithms, decisions, and routines. We draw, of course, on Deleuze and Guattari, and we suggest that these assemblages undergo constant assembly and reassembly. So you can see in our diagram here that these components are interacting in ways that might be a little bit more arborescent, hierarchical, easier to follow, or more rhizomatic, which would be non-hierarchical, more entangled, offering a more dynamic understanding than what traditional metaphors provide us. Let's move to the next slide. Using this metaphor, we unpack three kind of core insights that we find useful for developing management theory in this age. The first is that agency resides in assemblages. So this idea challenges the traditional dichotomy that sees agency as residing solely in humans, solely in algorithms, solely in data. We argue that there's a co-constitution here. So this moves beyond existing perspectives like the augmentation versus automation that still kind of maintain this dichotomy. Instead, we argue that the agency emerges from the assemblage itself. So those interactions between humans, algorithms, data, and the context that they're in. For example, credit scoring, there's been a lot of really good research on this, isn't simply a human or an algorithmic process, but it involves a lot of multiple and interacting assemblages across various domains. So this insight fundamentally reorients how we understand action and responsibility in algorithmic organizing. It's not pointing the finger necessarily at the data. It's not pointing the finger necessarily at the algorithm, but rather talking about how the group functions as a whole. Let's move to the next slide for our second key insight. So of course, if you're going to draw this kind of conclusion here, machine readability becomes a really important foundation for algorithmic decision making. So to understand organizations in this algorithmic age, we must recognize how machine readable data shapes organizations. I think we have many parallels with the concerns that Ghazi and Christine have alluded to, Dirk as well. But rather than seeing this as a limitation, we view this actually as an opportunity to develop more nuanced theories about the relationships between data and organizing. If we use this idea of organizations being algorithms, scholars, we argue, can better understand these complex data dynamics in ways that generate actually new and useful theoretical insights and help us to be able to overcome some of the risks and challenges that have been outlined here. Let's move to the third insight, please. So once we understand kind of data, a little bit more about the algorithms and how these things work together with us in a context of algorithmic decision making, obviously programming and prompting become really, really important new forms of expertise. So programming involves encoding values through processes like adaptation tuning and alignment tuning. Zhao et al., they have a really beautiful paper on that, and if you're interested in learning, I would highly recommend it. We see this as a form of values work that actually shapes algorithmic behavior. We find that prompting represents this fundamental shift where expertise becomes about effective instruction rather than direct performance, which is a pretty substantive shift from what has happened in the past. So professional implications become quite significant. Because of the reduced transparency, it changes the nature of expertise, requiring a lot of new evaluative practices. This insight here, we find it reveals how algorithmic organizations transform professional work in ways that existing metaphors cannot capture. We find that our metaphor helps with that, and we would certainly be open to conversation around that. Let's move to the next slide, please, James. So a few research implications. The first is if we're looking at the assemblage as the actor, we end up assuming, rather than assuming that all algorithms function similarly, we can investigate why algorithmic organizing takes different forms in different contexts. This kind of thinking helps us to be able to examine how I mean, we draw on Callan's work here, but you can link back to Deleuze and Guattari as well, where the different ways of organizing in these assemblages, when are they more or less effective? When do they become more or less useful? These kinds of questions we think represent really promising and important avenues for future research, that thinking of these entanglements, organizations as algorithms, really helps to support. Next slide, please. The next one we have is about the prompted organization. So our metaphor foregrounds this idea of the prompt. To organize algorithmically is essentially to be prompted. This raises some really interesting questions about where expertise resides with the prompter or in the responses that the organization or the algorithms provide. It's also inviting inquiry into how human values are instilled in algorithmic processes and who makes these critical decisions, which again, our point piece has really drawn out cleanly how this can be incredibly fraught and incredibly difficult. So let's move to the next slide. We're just I kind of close it off with a couple of contrasts. So as we understood the point position, we have this idea that corporate data threatens theory through scaling effects, proxies, algorithmic decision making. We have this distance between the conceptual and the operational definitions, and we see these as actually interesting phenomena worthy of study. Let's move to the next slide. Our point, we argue that management theory can be enhanced because of this opportunity that we have to study these different entanglements. Proxies and digital data are interesting phenomena in their own right, worthy of study, but certainly not the only forms of data available to management theorists. I'm going to jump in here as an ethnographer. I think we have so much opportunity to be able to generate and use existing data in order to be able to make sense of things as they are now and as they might be coming in the future. So we take a very optimistic stance here. We find that this era provides a lot of opportunities for innovative and relevant theorizing. Let's move to the next slide, please. This kind of sums up that point really quite succinctly and beautifully. We find this to be a dawn of exciting new theoretical possibilities. So to conclude, we'll just close with this idea that our metaphor, we don't just describe a new organizational reality. We're hoping to be able to enable new ways of thinking about organizations that can in fact advance management theory, where we take some of these concerns as grist for theorizing and recognizing that as we have a space within this, we have the opportunity to do some crafting as to which element of the assemblage takes precedence when, so that we can enable future theorizing to be robust, to be hopefully more truthful than perhaps what was argued in the point perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for those really interesting point and counterpoint. I think so we are right on time. So may I really thank very much all of our 4 speakers for their really insightful comments, and thank you so much for giving up your Friday morning stroke Friday afternoon for sharing with us, and thank you indeed to the JMS team for supporting us and for colleagues for attending, because it's really nice to have you with us for the PCP.